tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. We're coming into, and continuing from last week, looking at some of the material of the early Mahāyāna. As I said, partly because I want to build a foundation for our conversations around engaged practice, engaged Buddhist practice, social justice practice and praxis, how to understand being in the world, but also because the approach of the early Buddhist system that is so grounded in renunciation often needs to be contextualized or tempered for contemporary lay people who aren't in monastic systems and who really want support for being present with the full complexity of lay life in the contemporary world. So dealing with all of the challenges of the world as it is, our challenges in relationship and, in what, Brother Elder John Kabat-Zinn called full catastrophe living. And so, as is my style, I go in trying to figure out what to do about a very contemporary problem, and I end up feeling like we have to start at the beginning of the philosophical literature about this thing. So, I touched last week on just a hint of the beginning of Nagarjuna, the root verses on the middle way. And that's really the philosophical working out of ideas that originally come out in a body of texts known as the Perfection of Wisdom. So these begin, I'm not going to get super text heavy, so don't run away, or do, but come back. These texts start to appear a few hundred years after the time of the Buddha, and we don't know exactly when, but they start to get written down in the first couple centuries of the Common Era. So this is like 500 years after the time of the Buddha. And unlike the Pali Canon and the discourses of the Buddha that are preserved in the Pali Canon and the Chinese Agamas that were preserved as oral tradition, the Prajñāpāramitā, or the Perfection of Wisdom texts, they really are a body of literature. They were written first. And they read like literature. They're not hardly as easy to memorize. They're not full of stock phrases. They're much, much longer. So the root text of this tradition is known as the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines. And 8,000 lines means really stanzas or shlokas in Sanskrit, and they were written in Sanskrit first. The 8,000 line version gets expanded to a 25,000 line version, and then eventually to a 100,000 line version, and then contracted again and again and again to a 250 line or stanza version. That's the Diamond Sutra that we looked at a couple of years ago. We'll look at that again in a little bit, perhaps. And then all the way down to a 25 line version, which is the heart of the Prajñāpāramitā, the Heart Sutra. We'll look at that for sure. And ultimately down to the single syllable A, the first and primal syllable of the Sanskrit alphabet. Everything collapsing into a single letter. But I want to look a little bit at the very first of these texts, which is the 8,000 line version. There's not a great new translation of this. I wish my Sanskrit was better because I would love to take it on. It's not good enough for that. But I use a fairly old now translation by Edward Conzi. It's not too bad. It's gotten criticized, but I'm a little bit like, if you're going to criticize it, then retranslate it already. But it's pretty good. And It's conventionally, so this translation is from 1973. And so some of the ways that these concepts were understood has changed in the intervening 50 years since this appeared. And so I'll give a little bit of commentary as we go into it. But really, I'm just going to touch very lightly on the text, but talk about a couple concepts from it. And those of you who were here when we looked at the Diamond Sutra, the Diamond Sutra begins roughly the same way, so you'll recognize some of these concepts. It begins with a gathering of bodhisattvas in a kind of cosmic assembly. The whole thing, in a certain way, you can think of as taking place in a spiritual or formless dimension adjacent to our material dimension. So it names a place. The favorite place of discourses in the Perfection of Wisdom is a Vulture Peak Mountain, which is a place where the Buddha gave some talks and lived for a while in his human life. But it becomes this place of kind of mystical teaching also, with these cosmic bodhisattvas appearing, kind of gathering in a like a heaven realm near Vulture Peak. And so a tiny bit here on the word bodhisattva. We use it a lot nowadays in some communities to refer to Buddhist practitioners who devote their practice and in some ways their lives, or maybe perhaps their many lifetimes, to the well-being of all, to the well-being of others, to the liberation of others, to the liberation of all beings. And many different conceptions of the character of the Bodhisattva arose as the Mahāyāna developed. So the word Bodhisattva, or in Pali it's Bodhisatta, it just means awakened or awakening being. And in the Pali Canon, it refers to the Buddha before he was awakened. He said, when I was still only an unenlightened Bodhisatta, I practiced in this way, da-da-da-da. And so it refers to the Buddha throughout his previous lifetimes up until his awakening at age 33. And it particularly refers to the many lifetimes, perhaps extraordinary numbers of lifetimes spent developing the path, following a signature moment. And this becomes very important in the Mahāyāna. And this is the moment of meeting a Buddha. So for our Buddha, Shakyamuni's case, he met a Buddha named Dipankara. And in their meeting, Shakyamuni Buddha, before he was Shakyamuni, he gave rise to, or he made the vow or the great intention to become a Buddha. He was inspired by Dipankara Buddha. He said, I want to become a Buddha like that to benefit beings. And so you make the vow to become a Buddha in the presence of another Buddha. And then that Buddha recognizes you and gives you a prediction. And Dipankara Buddha says, excellent, you will become one day in the far future, innumerable lifetimes in the future, you will become a Buddha named Shakyamuni. You'll become fully awakened and benefit beings. And so this bit of story appears in the Pali Canon. So this is the link to the early tradition. As it develops, you get these beings, bodhisattvas, who are immensely close to being Buddhas, and eventually they become essentially the same as Buddhas, completely enlightened, except that they persist in samsara, the world of birth and death, in order to benefit beings. As this develops, it turns into ideas about bodhisattvas vowing to remain. It becomes, they really take on this beautiful quality of like non-dual devoted service, where they vow to remain in the world. And as this, in the earliest conception and in the in the Prajñāpāramitā, the perfection of wisdom, you don't see these images yet. They appear later, like in the Lotus Sutra and other scriptures written later on. But for instance, later, like in Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, there's images of like the Buddha Amida Buddha or Amitabha Bodhisattva, like standing at the gate. It really just looks like the gate to heaven, essentially, but it's the gate of liberation, and looking back at beings still suffering, and like they're one step away from crossing over completely, and they hold back because beings have not crossed over yet. Until all beings cross over, I will remain in the world to benefit beings. That becomes the Bodhisattva vow. And as the Mahāyāna develops, and you see the beginnings of this in the Prajñāpāramitā literature, you start to see the development of a critique of the early Buddhist ideal of the Arhat, who becomes fully liberated in a personal way, and then is no longer reborn. So when the Buddha says, this is my last birth, there is no more coming to any state of being, the Buddha has become a Buddha, but he's enunciating the Arhat ideal. You can become fully enlightened in this lifetime, and that means no further rebirths. And the thinkers that developed the Mahāyāna took this, what seems to be fairly literally, and decided that this ideal of the Bodhisattva, like if you want to become a fully enlightened Buddha, a Samma Sambuddha, a fully awakened Buddha, which is different from an Arhat. And Buddhas benefit more beings than Arhats because Buddhas can teach, and Arhats teach in a much more limited way. Buddhas teach in a much more cosmic way. That's the doctrine that developed. They began to develop this critique of the Arhat ideal, and to say, the Arhats are kind of just in it for personal liberation, but Bodhisattvas vow to contribute to the liberation of all beings. And so then that becomes a greater goal. And there develops a kind of animosity that persists to this day. The Mahāyāna school, some of the Mahāyāna schools invented a term to be in opposition to the Mahāyāna. Maha means great, and yana is like vehicle, the great vehicle, right? Because it liberates all beings. The Mahāyānists, some Mahāyānists invented a term to refer to non-great vehicle traditions, of which the Theravada is the last remaining extant non-Mahāyāna tradition. And the term is Hinayana, which you might have seen. And Hina means small or lesser. And it's an insult. And so don't use it. But there are some Tibetan schools who use it saying that it's not an insult. But a lot of Theravada folks, especially in Southeast Asia, will hear it as an insult. And when I was in North India practicing at Thai temples, and I was with Theravada teachers, there was one time we were outside of Bodh Gaya, just off of retreat, and we were in the Tibetan area, which was a whole kind of village, but it was also kind of a bit like a refugee camp, lots of tents and things, but it was fairly permanent. And we were in a little Tibetan cafe there, having momos and salty tea and things like that. Very lovely, and some Tibetan monks were in there, and we got talking with them, and they were super interested. Americans are here practicing, and they found out what we were doing. That we were practicing with the Thai and doing vipassana. And one of them got this look in his face, and he said, "Oh, you're Hinayana." And it was really like, oh, you have not on the way, you haven't found the way. And it was, and we were, I was like, yeah, I know, yes and no. And but that developed at a certain point, this kind of like critique. And it's a critique that is still relevant, partly because you can still get insulted by it nowadays, but also because it does touch into, I think, something that's really important, which is the intent with which we are practicing and the way that it is possible to practice from a more kind of I don't want to say selfish or self-centered, but foregrounded kind of way, you know. What to say about this? I'm not pleased by the way that the critique turns into animosity, partly because I think it sometimes unintentionally, but often ends up, because it wants to emphasize the communal and the liberation of all, it can denigrate practices that are directed toward and meant for individual healing and liberation. And one of the shadows of doing this is that folks enjoy the rhetoric of, you know, liberating all beings, and then don't really do their own healing work as individuals, you know. And I think we can see this sometimes outside of Buddhist circles, but you can see this in some, you know, justice and activist circles where there's so much of a focus on the external that there can be a neglect of the individual, particularly because many of us have come to a very appropriate critique of individualism as a doctrine, you know. And so then here comes the Mahāyāna and says, yeah, well, the individuals don't exist anyway. And you're like, thank you, I knew that. But then they also come in and say, and there's no such thing, or there's no value in the pursuit of individual liberation. And so just watch out for that as a sticky slope toward not practicing, right, for yourself. But we'll see that a little bit. We see that a bit in the beginning of the Perfection of Wisdom literature. So here's the setting. So that's a bit about the Mahāyāna. I'll say more as we go on. But here's the setting. The Buddha is teaching on Vulture Peak Mountain to a great assembly of bodhisattvas. All right, one more historical piece before we go on. The Prajñāpāramitā, Prajñā is wisdom, Paramita means perfection, it also means going beyond. So the Perfection of Wisdom literature is written roughly in the same style as some of the discourses. It starts with the "Thus have I heard," which the Pali discourses begin with. That's Ananda, the Buddha's cousin and attendant, remembering the discourses and repeating them. They start in the same way, and they start with a statement of where the Buddha was when he gave it. So, many of the Pali discourses begin, "Thus have I heard. At one time, the Blessed One was staying at Sawati in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." So the Perfection of Wisdom starts the same way. "Thus have I heard. The Lord dwelled at Rajgriha on the Vulture Peak together with a great gathering of monks, with 1,250 monks, all of them arhants. Their outflows dried up, undefiled, fully controlled, quite freed in their hearts, well freed and wise, thoroughbreds, great serpents," that's nagas, spiritual dragons. "Their work done, their task accomplished, their burden laid down, their own wheel accomplished with the fetters that bound them to becoming extinguished, their hearts well freed by right understanding, in perfect control of their whole minds, with the exception of one single person, the Venerable Ananda." So this is a standard introduction. And the reference to Ananda means that this discourse is placing itself between, the Buddha is alive, and so Ananda is not yet an arahant. This is a very famous story about Ananda, that he doesn't become fully enlightened in the Buddha's lifetime. He's the Buddha's attendant for most of the Buddha's life. He remembers all the discourses, but he's only a stream enterer. And so he has more defilements than the rest of the arhants, and they tease him about it a bit. He's very high status in the Sangha, but he's not liberated, and he's a little bit the Frodo in the story. He's the everyman, person. And so, for instance, Ananda is the one where apparently he was quite charming and very friendly, and there's a story where a young woman falls in love with him and wants to marry him. She knows he won't marry her because he's a monk unless she can convince him to disrobe and become a layperson again. And so she goes to a local witch and gets a love potion. And then she invites Ananda for a meal at her house with her family. Her family's in on it because they want her to get a good husband, and Ananda's a good guy. And so Ananda comes for the meal offering, eats the meal, and she drugs his meal with the love potion. And the text says that Ananda noticed that his senses were getting muddied and something was happening for him, and he was unable to get up and leave. So the best that he could do was to sit still in meditation and not speak. So Ananda just goes mute, and he's high, and she's giving him MDMA or something, and he's like, whoa, I'm altered. It's a love potion, essentially, and eventually the Buddha and the monks are like, hey, where's Ananda? And somebody's like, he hasn't come back from that girl's house. And the Buddha's like, let's go get him. And they go get him, and they find Ananda in samadhi, just breathing, and the Buddha sees what has happened, and he says, don't do this to the lay people, and they bring Ananda home, but there's several stories of Ananda and people falling in love with him, and it's not that he was completely unresponsive. There's a very beautiful moment in the discourse around the Buddha's death, the Mahāyāna Sutta, Digha 16, where the Buddha's about to die, and Ananda says, so Blessed One, what should we do about women? He's a monk. He's not yet fully liberated. He's human. He's straight, it seems like. So he's like, what should we do about women? And the Buddha says, don't look at them. And he says, well, what if we do look at them? And the Buddha says, well, don't talk to them. And he says, okay, well, what if we do talk to them? And he kind of goes on for a little bit, and the Buddha eventually is like, just be mindful, Ananda, and so this is Ananda. So the text begins with everybody's enlightened except Ananda. So there you are. But the text begins as if it's an ordinary sutta, and this is now a literary device that's also a bid for in a way a bid for inclusion in the canon, and it works, right? That there's the sense that these were talks, or these were situations actually spoken by the Buddha. They're not as historically referenceable as the texts of the canon, of the Pali Canon, and certainly when miracles start to happen, when the Buddha conjures 100,000 lion thrones for Buddhas of all the cosmic directions to come and sit on, but even though they all sit on 100,000 lion thrones, they don't take up the space of a single room, and the Buddha begins to emit rainbow-colored light out of his third eye. They get super trippy and cosmic. The proposal is still that they happened during the life of the Buddha, but in some they're like a visionary literature laid on top of a historical literature. If we think of the Pali Canon as historical literature, which it is and isn't, right? So that's partly a way to understand these. But some Mahāyāna traditions right now, if you hang out with some Tibetan lineage folks and others, will still assert that these texts did literally happen, or are literal teachings of the Buddha, the human Buddha, in the same way that the Pali Canon was. So there is some, they get held differently by different traditions. All right, but just to get to the beginning story of this, the central speaker in this text is a bodhisattva named Subhuti, and the sort of straight man in it, or the exemplar of the early tradition, is the arahant that we would know as Sariputta in Pali. Here he's Shariputra in Sanskrit, and he is the one who, he's the foremost in wisdom of the early tradition. Here he's the one who doesn't quite get it. And so they invent a new literature where the most wise of the Buddha's early disciples doesn't quite understand the next turning of the wheel. So he understands emptiness from this kind of simplistic way, but he doesn't quite understand it in its fullness. And so then the discourse unfolds with this Bodhisattva Subhuti, who knows the new system, teaching his kind of younger brother or elder brother, but not as wise, Shariputra, what's really up. So Shariputra is kind of the fall guy in this. And then Subhuti is the sort of new, the new wave teacher. So the Buddha says to Venerable Subhuti, the elder, "Make it clear now, Subhuti, to the Bodhisattvas, the great beings, starting from perfect wisdom, how the Bodhisattvas, the great beings, go forth into perfect wisdom." And so that's the initial question. The Buddha says to Subhuti, "Teach the perfection of wisdom, would you? How do Bodhisattvas go forth into the perfection of wisdom?" And so Subhuti Subhuti knows deconstruction, and Subhuti's like he's like the Derrida of the Dharma. You quote me on that. To the French philosophers. So Subhuti doesn't answer the question. What he does is he deconstructs the question. He says, the Lord has said, "Make it clear now, Subhuti, to the Bodhisattvas, how the Bodhisattvas, the great beings, go forth into perfect wisdom." When one speaks of a Bodhisattva, what Dharma does that word Bodhisattva denote? I do not, O Lord, see that Dharma, Bodhisattva, nor a Dharma called perfect wisdom. Since I neither find nor apprehend nor see a Dharma Bodhisattva, nor a perfect wisdom, what Bodhisattva shall I instruct and admonish in what perfect wisdom? So this is the beginning and the heart of the whole thing. The Buddha says, Subhuti, teach the Bodhisattvas how to go forth into perfect wisdom. And Subhuti says, what's a Bodhisattva? What is perfect wisdom? How can I teach? And essentially he's going to say, how can I teach something that doesn't exist to beings who don't exist? Because the word Bodhisattva can't denote anything. And the word perfect wisdom can't denote anything. So what this builds off of then, and we talked about this a little last week, is the teaching on emptiness. The word is sunya, is empty. That's the Pali shunya in Sanskrit. And the quality that becomes emptiness is shunyata. And so shunyata is the nature of a thing, or the mark of emptiness in an experience, a thing, an entity, an experience, an object, a being. Emptiness appears in the Pali Canon as the recognition of absence. So the original metaphor is very simple and material. There's a barn, there's no horses in it, the barn is empty of horses. Super straightforward. But, so now you can say, oh, there's a being. There's a great being. That great being is empty of a thing that could be called bodhisattva. In other words, it's empty of an identity, right? Why? Because nothing can be defined singularly, right? Because to say that something is a bodhisattva would have to contract it into that definition. And we started this conversation off in the Q&A a little bit, talking about like, okay, what does it mean for this to be a non-dual system? We can get to that word a little bit more later on. But essentially, if there's a bodhisattva, there must be beings that are not bodhisattvas. And if that's true, then these are both limited designations. And of course, can you become a bodhisattva? If you weren't one and then you become one, right? What does it mean to have taken on that designation? So Subhuti says, I cannot see a dharma, which really means like a thing, an existent thing, which is a reasonable translation of the word dharma, by the way. That's one of the translations of it. It's just, an arising phenomena is a dharma or a dhamma. So I cannot see an arising phenomena known as bodhisattva, and I cannot see an arising or existent phenomena known as perfect wisdom. So how could I teach them? So that's the core paradox, right? Nothing can be truly identified. And if you want to simplify that, you can say nothing can be identified as separate, unique, individual, stable as a thing. But Subhuti knows this, and you can't start an 8,000 line text with a paradox and just leave it there, because then you would just put the book down, right? So Subhuti says, and yet, O Lord, if when this is pointed out, if a bodhisattva's heart does not become cowed nor stolid, it does not despair nor despond, if they do not turn away or become dejected, it is just this bodhisattva, this great being, who should be instructed in perfect wisdom. It is precisely this that should be recognized as the perfect wisdom of that bodhisattva. When they thus stand firm, that is their instruction. And so the teaching that there's no dharma called bodhisattva or perfect wisdom that can be apprehended, that teaching is the instruction itself. So Subhuti, he said, I can't teach the bodhisattva's perfect wisdom. His saying of that is the teaching of it, right? He just taught it. He said, yeah, I just did it. Did you get it? He says, and if you're not afraid of that, like if that doesn't, startle you in some way, if you're like, okay, I'm cool with that, you're a bodhisattva, right? We're going to get into very recursive logic here. So when they thus stand firm, that is their instruction and admonition. Moreover, when a bodhisattva courses in perfect wisdom and develops it, they should train themselves so that they do not pride themselves on that thought of enlightenment. The thought of enlightenment is bodhicitta. That's what makes you a bodhisattva, is you have the thought or the intention of full awakening. So you don't become proud because of that, because that thought, bodhicitta, the intention for enlightenment, is no thought, since in its essential original nature, thought is transparently luminous. Transparently luminous. And so it goes on like this for a long time. I'm not going to keep reading it to you. Go and read it. I'll put a link to a place where you can read it in the notes. But one of the ways we can get toward this is in the direction of the meditation that we did, where there's the perceiving of things. You notice objects. You can to get really straightforward. You can see things. You can hear things. You have sensations. You have feelings, emotions, thoughts. When we practice not appropriating or grasping at or solidifying or making into I, me, or mine those perceptions, there's a releasing that you can feel, right? We practice it in meditation as a kind of, don't grasp onto the perception. You keep backing up, or becoming more spacious. Kuan Yin does this by resting in the listening. We'll talk about that. And the sense is of a non-apprehending. I don't love that translation. We could just go with a non-grasping at, or a non-solidifying around any experience. And with that non-solidifying, that's going to also mean not solidifying into language or categories or identities, right? So you don't become a bodhisattva and then like fixate on that identity. Oh, now I'm a bodhisattva. You know, I took bodhisattva vows and now I'm a bodhisattva. It's very funny. That's totally what Mahāyāna practice does. They ritualize it. They're like, now you do the ritual of becoming a bodhisattva, even though the foundation of the entire thing is that there's no such thing as a bodhisattva that can be found. And so then it's going to wrap around itself over and over. The one who thinks that they're a bodhisattva isn't a bodhisattva. The one who understands that there could be no such thing as a bodhisattva, that's more like a bodhisattva. The one who vows to save all beings is a bodhisattva, but the one who thinks that there is such a thing as beings to be saved is not a bodhisattva. Only the one who understands that there's no such thing as beings, that person is a bodhisattva. That one is a bodhisattva. And so the text begins like this. So it goes from emptiness, right? The barn is empty of horses, to emptiness of conceptual categories. This being is empty of the category suffering being, bodhisattva, enlightened being, being on the path. All of those things that I might constrict or calcify an identity around, I discard those concepts. I say, I'm not going to get caught by that concept. I'm a Buddhist on the path. That's a constricting concept, right? I'm going to take bodhisattva vows to save other. That's a constricted concept, right? And so so then the classic question is, how does a bodhisattva practice? How do they stand? How do they walk? How do they work with their thoughts? That's the core question in the Diamond Sutra. How does a bodhisattva stand? How do they walk? How do they control their thoughts? And the answer, of course, is they don't stand anywhere. They control by not controlling. They walk by understanding that no one walks and no one gets anywhere, and there's no path traveled on. That's what we touched last week with Nagarjuna. He says, how can you even think of traveling along a path? You'd have to solidify the concept of the one who moves along the path as somehow being a continuous, individual, separate experience, moving along a path that is a continuous, contiguous experience with past and present and future, and the concept of going somewhere. The Bodhisattva doesn't constrict around any of those concepts. And where this is going to end up then, right, as you can tell, I imagine, is really in a conversation around what it means to say that something exists. In the Buddha's first discourse, the turning of the wheel, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the very first thing the Buddha says to his 5 ascetic friends is, I have found the middle way between sensual indulgence and bodily mortification. And that middle way is this noble eightfold path. And then he teaches the Full Noble Truth that includes the Noble Eightfold Path. So the very first teaching of the Buddha's entire career is the middle way. And when he first teaches it, it's the middle. It's a very pragmatic middle way. It's a type of practice. And he says sensual indulgence doesn't work. He knows what that's like. He was a rich kid. And mortification, ascetic practice that punishes the body, also doesn't work. That there's a middle way that avoids both extremes, the extreme of indulgence and the extreme of repression. That term then, the middle way, gets appropriated or developed in the Mahāyāna to mean the middle way between any extreme. And one of the main extremes, philosophically, is the extreme, is the existential extreme, essentially. Things exist, like in a pure materialistic philosophy, things exist because you can contact them. The thinking, saying something doesn't exist is meaningless. There it is, right? There's my glasses. They exist. They're hard. They function. They have a name. They exist. Stop being a philosophy major on me here, right? Very straightforward. That's straightforward materialism. On the other end, there's a radical kind of nihilism that says nothing exists even temporarily in any way that matters. And this kind of nihilism is going to say, and this is the problem that came up in our Q&A, right? This is the danger in these teachings, or it's the shadow of them, is that if you take them to the extreme of nihilism, you can end up with the deep bypass philosophy that actions don't matter, that choices don't matter, that there's no good and evil or no gain and loss, that there's no harm really of beings, right? If beings don't really exist, then it doesn't matter if you kill them, that kind of thing. And that was a philosophy that was around in the time of the Buddha. And the Buddha rejected both what he called eternalist philosophies and nihilist philosophies. Eternalism is a deeper version of the materialist kind of, things exist. Eternalism is like the Christian idea that you have an eternal individual soul that has always been individual and separate from God and will always be individual and separate from God, and you'll retain a kind of individual essence for all time in an unchanging way. Right? So ideas of a permanent soul, an individual soul, or the Vedanta idea in Hinduism of a permanent divine soul, that the individual soul is in relationship to lots of variations of that idea. Those are eternalisms. The Mahāyāna is going to say, we're going to chart a middle way between extremes. We're not going to take up the extreme of eternalism, like you have an eternal soul or material things are solidly real. Neither are we going to take up the extreme of nihilism and say nothing exists and therefore nothing matters. We're going to try to chart a middle way between those things. And that's going to take some philosophical squirming, because it's not entirely clear in what way things exist or don't. And so partly what you can see in this early turning in the Prajñāpāramitā, and this is some of the language I don't completely love in this translation, is it's going to land with statements like, because nothing exists, ... Like because there's no such Dharma as a Bodhisattva or a perfect wisdom, ... Like the conclusion runs very close, to the cliff edge of nihilism, right? Nothing exists, therefore nothing has meaning. And what the tradition is going to have to develop, and it does develop, and that this develops through Nagarjuna into different forms of the Mahāyāna, different forms of the non-dual, is a philosophical system that reckons with the way that emptiness, the absence of self, the absence of essence, it makes philosophical sense, logical sense, but also it's a meditative state that you can contact and experience that is undeniably potent. You can enter the state that recognizes that everything is process and flux and non-individual flow. And that's profoundly liberating, to unhook from story that deeply. as in meditation, in a meditative state. And you can even decide that because you experience that in meditation, that is the true nature of the cosmos. But then you have to come back to relationship. You come out of that meditation and there's your sweetheart, and there's your monastic brothers and sisters, and there's your kids, and there's your president doing their thing. You know, there's the people that you meet in the neighborhood, the people that you meet as you walk down the street, you know. And that world, the world, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, you know, and all of the more evil places in the world that are less good than Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, they're all full of people and beings and ethical challenges that you have to engage with. Like, you can't disappear from the world. And so in this beginning of the perfection of wisdom literature, right in this very first couple paragraphs that we touched on tonight, what you get is the tension that we as practitioners have to reckon with, which is Subhuti, teach the path to the Bodhisattvas. And Subhuti is like, what's a Bodhisattva? You know, and he's going to end up saying, there's no such thing as a Bodhisattva, but if I don't teach the Bodhisattvas, who will? In a way, like, it still has to be taught. Therefore, I'm going to teach, and the Bodhisattvas who are not afraid of this are the Bodhisattvas. And so it comes back and forth between, like, I will engage by trying to understand together that engagement isn't what we think it is. It's far emptier of concept and bondage than we think it is. It seems like to engage is to have to enter the world of concept and relationship, and it is. But bodhisattvas do that without believing that that's reality. Bodhisattvas enter the worlds of relationship and engagement without being hypnotized by them. And you're going to start to get images of, like, bodhisattvas in hell realms or bodhisattvas in ghost realms. And later on, you're going to start to get practices like lucid dreaming, of remaining fully lucid and aware in the clearly fantastical, unreal worlds of dreams, and being a bodhisattva there, and recognizing that the material real world isn't all that different from the dream world when you're awake. And awakening is going to mean not getting caught by any of these concepts, even as you use them. You have to use them because it's the world, but you don't have to believe them. You don't have to believe that they define you or they define the situation. But you're going to be surrounded by people who believe them in a life or death kind of way, who cling profoundly to concepts of identity and possession and self and other and conflict. And so then the bodhisattva lives in, and even, like, devotes themselves to embracing this extraordinary paradox. And this is what becomes the middle way. The paradox of understanding that nothing really exists, but everything is real. If real means creates experience, it exists in relationship. And so there's always this either flow between, or it's really going to become a kind of simultaneous inhabiting of, right, samsara and nirvana. Samsara, the world of self and other, and of relationships, and of birth and death. And nirvana, the extinguishment of all grasping to those things. And so it's not so much, I think it's reductive to create, the ideal of the bodhisattva who vows to become a Buddha, and save all beings, and create that in opposition somehow to the arahant who liberates themselves. If we really take on the perfection of wisdom, that duality gets blown out of the water, because the liberated heart has gone beyond that's what the gone beyond means, has gone beyond even the idea of samsara and nirvana. And arahants can do this. There's no distinction, and the text says it. The text says, oh yeah, even the arahants, if they apply their minds to this, they'll get this. They're actually very close to it. All they have to do is let go of the idea that they're enlightened in a way that takes them out of samsara. That's just a concept. That there's liberation and non-liberation, samsara and nirvana. Right? You see those as empty. The Bodhisattva sees those as empty and is liberated even from the idea of liberation. But to do this takes extraordinary practice, and it's the practice of not getting caught. Which maybe we could metaphorically say, it's the practice of not falling asleep. And so then the practice becomes very friendly with this kind of open, awareness-based, non-discriminatory kind of meditation, where you practice taking everything as it is, eventually including, defiled thoughts. Here's a hateful thought. It's just as empty as anything else. And again, the shadow here is that you like that idea so much that you don't practice dealing with your defilements, and they just continue to run the show. And you remind yourself every once in a while that they're already liberated and not a problem, and you don't do your work. Don't fall into that extreme. I think that's in the direction of the nihilist extreme, actually, because you're not taking the ethical action to deal with your own shadows. But you don't fall into the eternalist extreme either, of thinking that you're going to deal with them and then be like permanently free in some sort of like fantasy heaven realm where you don't have to deal with the world. Right? And so again and again, we'll come back to a middle way here. All right, so we'll pause there for now. May we course in the middle way between extremes and not fall off the knife edge of the cliff in either direction. Or if we do, we understand that even the cliff is empty, the edge is empty. It's a very forgiving system, but you have to practice it. So may we practice, may we be liberated, and know what that means. And we'll continue with this, and there's some layers to unpack here, so we'll continue next week with this text and related questions.